Okay, hello. I watched parts of the previous streams, and it seems like there's a delay between when the stream starts and like when I click the button and when stuff happens. So hopefully I'm live right now. I think I've fixed sound mostly. I've fixed Hypernomicon, and we should be good to go. Oh, and I was deciding whether to keep doing this or not, and the main consideration is whether this is slower than doing this not on a stream, but I just timed myself reading another article, Maddie Eklund's Personal Identity Concerns and Indeterminacy, and it didn't seem to be any slower when I do it on a stream compared to my normal way, my previous normal way perhaps. So we're gonna do some research. Today we're starting with metapsychological, metapsychological. I kept calling it metaphysical the other day. Metapsychological Relativism and the Self by Stephen L. White. Let's get going. I'm grateful for the comments and criticisms of members of the audience. Blah, blah, blah. Bogosian, Johnston, Parfit, Carol Ravane, Peter Unger. Good group of people to comment on your personal identity paper. Recent discussion of the problem of personal identity is focused on the distinction between two kinds of theories. Derek Parfit characterizes reductionism as holding, one, the fact of a person's identity over time just consists in the holding of certain more particular facts, and two, that these facts can be described without either presupposing the identity of this person or explicitly claiming that the experiences of this person's life are had by this person, or even explicitly claiming that this person exists. These facts can be described in an impersonal way. And three, a person's existence just consists of the existence of brain and body and the occurrence of a series of interrelated physical and mental events. Let's actually, do I have reductionism? Parfit, 1984, 210. So it looks like, oh no, this is, here we go, yeah. So I do have basically the page numbers in Hypernomicon already. Let's say that there is a direct psychological connection between two person stages X and Y, if and only if Y can never remember having an experience X had, or Y acts in a way that realizes the intention of X's, or Y has a belief, desire, or some other psychological feature possessed by X. The strong connectedness of two person stages requires that enough such direct psychological connections hold between them. Psychological continuity is the holding of overlapping chains of strong connectedness. Suppose that we know the psychological connections and continuities exist between two person stages A and B, as well as what physical relations obtain between them, and suppose we know the same about the relations between the earlier person stage A and any stage C, whose claim to be the stage of the same person A competes with B's. Then, according to the reductionist view, which Parfit endorses, we know everything relevant to deciding whether A and B are stages of the same person. Parfit, following Hume, sees an analogy between questions of personal identity and questions about the identity of nations over time. Whether England was the same nation after the Norman Conquest is a question that can only be settled by reference to the connections and continuities among people and institutions. The same way questions of personal identity must be settled solely by reference to the psychological and physical connections and continuities among person stages. The non-reductionist, in contrast, holds that there are facts of personal identity above and beyond, over and above impersonal facts. In what follows, I shall criticize both non-reductionism and Parfit's reductionist alternative. Although the theoretical options that Parfit provides are the only ones ordinarily offered, I shall argue that there is a more attractive theory than either of those between which we have thus far been forced to choose. So I don't really have non-reductionism in Hypernomicon. I only have reductionism. The usual non-reductionists are the soul theorists, the further fact theorists. They're not in here. I don't know if the narrativicists are reductionists. I think they probably are, but I don't have them under reductionism right now. There might have been a reason for that. It might depend on the narrativist. We're just going to leave things. We're not going to put non-reductionism in here yet. And I don't know what his view is going to be, but I'm reading this paper because it was cited in a conventionalist paper that I read earlier. So presumably he's going to introduce conventionalism. The non-reductionist view is that there are facts of personal identity in addition to impersonal facts involving... The reductionist view that there are facts of personal identity in addition to the impersonal facts involves a number of problems. Since I agree with Parfit that this view is untenable, I shall raise what I take to be the most serious objections before discussing reductionism. These objections and Parfit's are largely complementary. So I guess we do need non-reductionism in here somewhere just to get his objections against it. Yeah, it's almost not even worth putting this in, but it never hurts to just have a bit more detail in Hypernomicon, I think, is good. What's this guy's name? White. And what year is this? 1989. Okay. Proponents of non-reductionism face a dilemma. Either the facts to which existence they are committed are subjective, that is, facts to which the person whose identity is in question has some special form of access, or they are objective. Subjective facts, I shall argue, are not the kind of facts which can determine the kind of identity of a person over time. On the other hand, objective facts are the kind required for non-reductionism. If they did set up questions of personal identity, it would make it completely mysterious why these questions held any significance or interest. Okay. So it's a little tricky to put dilemma arguments into Hypernomicon because you have to sort of explain both horns of the dilemma in the one argument, and then it gets to be a long argument, but that's what we're going to do because I haven't found a better way to do it. So argues position is false. The most convincing exponent who may or may not have been advocated the subjective version of non-reductionism is Thomas Nagel. Nagel claims that the true nature of the problem of personal identity is obscured by discussions that focus on continuities and similarities, whether these are physical, mental, causal, or emotional. Given that any such set of conditions is met, there is still a further question whether the same subject himself is preserved under these conditions. The view which Nagel's remarks suggest is one according to which there are irreducible subjective facts in addition to the objective facts. Whether sugar tastes like this to other people is one such fact, and the question whether the subject of this experience will exist in the future situation is another. There are two characteristics that for Nagel connect the problem of personal identity with the problem of subjective character of experience. Unlike facts about objective entities, facts about the subject herself as it figures in the problem of personal identity, and facts about subjective character of experiences are not facts about entities in the world, and unlike facts about objective entities, the relevant facts about the subject and about subjective experience are accessible only from the first person point of view. They are not accessible even in principle from any point of view other than that of the subject in question. It's in virtue of these two shared characteristics that the aspects of the subject which are relevant to personal identity as well as the subjective aspects of experience fall on the subjective side of Nagel's subjective-objective distinction. It follows that on this view that although we may be fallible in our judgments about subjective facts, we have what might be called third-person incorrigibility, where such facts are concerned, that is, we could not be corrected by anyone about the subjective facts to which we have access. The problem for this view is that our judgments about the facts of personal identity are not third-person incorrigible. Suppose to take an example of parfits that would create a time t a molecule for molecule duplicate of Smith in a qualitatively indistinguishable environment. If you leave Smith unchanged, this duplicate will believe mistakenly that he is Smith and that he has existed long before t, and these seem to be straightforwardly mistaken beliefs about the facts of personal identity, which could be corrected by any external observer with access to enough objective facts. If such a duplicate would not be making a mistake about the fact of personal identity, a fact of the kind to which the proponent of the subjective view claims we have third-person incorrigible access, it's unclear what could count as such a fact. The only kind of facts which is even plausible to claim are third-person incorrigible, are facts about the contents of present states of awareness. Personal identity over time, however, must consist in some further facts about the relations between such states, and these further facts would not be determined by the content of the single state of awareness. Thus, the facts of personal identity, which were not fixed by the totality of impersonal facts, could not be subjective facts. Suppose, then, that the facts about personal identity that exist current to non-reductionism over and above the impersonal facts are not subjective in Nagel's sense. In this case, it'd be difficult to see how such a fact, to which we had no special access from the first-person point of view, could explain the intuitions that motivate non-reductionism. If there's any reason to postulate facts over and above the impersonal facts, it's that we feel we have access to something over and above such facts. The postulation of objective facts to which we have no means of access, whether subjective or not, has been suggested, to which no means of access, whether subjective or not, has been suggested, would seem to raise far more serious problems than any which may have motivated non-reductionism. And given this conspicuous lack of access to facts of personal identity thus construed, it's hard to see how such fact could make a difference to anything that matters. So this dilemma argument turned out to be relatively short, so it's not a problem that it's a single entry in Hypernomicon. Okay, done with that argument. Reductionism and the instability of our intuitive judgments. In spite of the difference in their respective views, Parfit adopts one of the basic assumptions of those committed to non-reductionism. The assumption is that crucial divisions in discussions of personal identity is between non-reductionists and reductionists. On this assumption, once we abandon the intuitions about subjective facts which underlie non-reductionism, the deep problem should disappear. Nagel says, for instance, that the concept of the self is the concept of something independent of objective facts, and adds that this may be an illusion. If we have no self to speak of the same self as this one in complete detachment, it may make no sense to speak of the same self as this one in complete detachment from all external conditions, but it's still the internal idea of the self that gives rise to the problem of personal identity. And Parfit, though he's not explicit in making this assumption, suggests a number of remarks that the most difficult puzzles surrounding personal identity will disappear when we drop our prejudice against reductionism. It's this shared assumption to which I shall show is unjustified. To suppose that the philosophical problem of personal identity is solely the result of bias in favor of non-reductionism underestimates the tension within reductionism itself. Consider 3 examples. Example number 1, memory switch case. Suppose your brain is physically altered in such a way that it comes to contain the information have the dispositions of another subject, say Smith. Smith's brain is similarly altered with the result that it contains the information has the dispositions yours has now. Thus, the person who wakes up in your present body after the operation will seem to remember doing all the things Smith now remembers doing and will have Smith's desires, goals, and intentions. Similarly, the person who wakes up in Smith's body will have your present psychology, which then is the two resultant persons is you. It seems implausible to suppose that for most people the continued possession of a particular body could be more significant than the possession of a particular sort of psychological makeup. Not even our most serious accidents in which some person survives undermine our belief that the original person survives, unless of course there is damage to the brain and the psychology of the original person is not preserved. But if one survives the radical alteration of the type of body one has, what significance could the numerical identity of one's body have for one's continued existence? We can, if we like, imagine a case in which the new body would be qualitatively identical to the old one. In such a case, neither the subject nor any observer should need notice any difference. And presumably it's the person with one's memories and psychological dispositions who would realize one's goals and projects. Thus, the conclusion would be that the person with one's memories and personality would be the natural one to draw. Seems the natural one to draw. Example 2, the future pain case. Imagine that you're given the following news. You're going to be tortured 24 hours from now. There's no chance of reprieve, but you're offered the following consolations. First, before the torture is administered, you'll suffer complete amnesia regarding your present experiences. Second, you'll be given a set of delusive memories about your past. Third, you'll be given a set of dispositions to behave which are at odds with your present character, which constitute a basic change in present personality. As the final consolation, the same kinds of psychological changes will be effected in another subject who, after suffering amnesia, will seem to remember the things you remember now and exhibit your personality traits. Could any of the changes relive the apprehension you feel about the impending torture? The argument that they could not is relatively simple. The first 3 conditions, though they might add to one's apprehension on other grounds, do not seem to lessen the anxiety one would justifiably feel about the future pain. If, on the other hand, none of the 3 conditions is any help, it's hard to see how the experience of someone else could have any bearing on the situation whatsoever. Example number 3, the California therapy case. Imagine a therapeutic technique that's planned to remove all the psychological blocks that prevent one from resolving one's problems and using one's opportunities in the most effective way possible. The therapy is effective whatever the blocks involve. Whether the blocks involve guilt, fear, depression, or anxiety, the therapy requires a session of 8 hours a week, during which one is unconscious and which can be scheduled during the hours one is normally asleep. Imagine you agree to try the therapy or given a sedative, awake, refreshed, with no knowledge, no memories of the session. Suppose the results exceed even your most optimistic expectations. Your capacity to deal effectively and confidently with situations you confront far surpasses that of your earlier self. Suppose now that after months of satisfaction with the therapy, the underlying process is explained. After the sedative is administered, the brain matter that realizes your memories and personality is restructured in order to realize the memories and personality of another subject. The resulting person is then awakened and subjected to hours of excruciating painful procedure without anesthesia. The procedure, however, leaves no discernible effects after the session. At the end of the session, that person is sedated, the original structural features of your brain are restored, and you're awakened. If you had been satisfied with the therapy before all the facts were disclosed, would it be rational to discontinue it after the disclosure? Those who are incurably squeamish might be offered a pill that would erase the memories of the explanation of the procedure. If the decision is made purely on selfish grounds, there are no obvious reasons why you should fear the experience of the procedure, given its complete dissociation from your own life history. Furthermore, there is a serious objection to the idea that one should discontinue the therapy. One's experience, given that one takes the therapy, is exactly analogous to the actual experience of one of the personalities of multiple personality subject. In such a subject, the dissociation between the personalities may have been the only available response to a painful situation that the subject as a whole could not avoid. To suppose that forgetting the details of the therapy and continuing to represent merely kind of philosophical error would be to ignore how deep the sources of a pre-theoretical intuition supporting the therapy might be. The most important point of these examples is to bring out that rejecting non-reductionism for reductionism brings us no closer to solution of the puzzles they pose. The problem lies in the instability of our intuitions as we move from one case to another. That our intuitions are unstable in terms of reductionism follows from the fact that the descriptions of all 3 examples are compatible with their complete equivalence relative to that view. That is, descriptions are compatible with the stipulation that the degrees of bodily continuity, psychological continuity, and causal continuity are in each case exactly the same. This fact is, of course, deliberately obscured in the second example. The physical details of the subject's transformation are ignored, and the description of the events that as things that could happen to you might be regarded as question begging, although it's important to notice that this description is part of an event in the example, not part of the description of the example. The fact that in the example other people describe the person who is to suffer as you will be important later. Okay. To object on these grounds, however, would be to miss the point. On the view suggested by the first example, what matters to one's identity are one's memories and one's psychological dispositions. On this view, the description of the second example is one in which you would be given false memories, you would be given a different personality, and you would be tortured, would not be question-begging but incoherent. The point of the example, however, is that the description is not incoherent. I don't know if I buy this. I don't know. I'll keep reading. It's not incoherent. We have no apparent difficulty in understanding the example described. Furthermore, our reaction to the example completely reverses our original response. In that case, it's bodily continuity, not the continuity of memories and psychological dispositions that seems to matter, even when it's pointed out that the description of the second case is compatible with the description of the first. Would seem reluctant to disavow the second response. What does seem to happen, however, is that we evaluate our reaction to the first case in light of our recognition that the first case is susceptible to the redescription the second case provides. That is, the second reaction undermines the first. So White here is clearly saying the second description doesn't beg the question. I think other people claim it begs the question. Williams likes the second description, but he's willing to sort of entertain the possibility that it kind of begs the question from the point of view of the psychological people. There's a person who responds to Williams. Let me see if I can just find it. This guy, Ortsegbubemi Vanilioe, responds to William. Yeah, so this guy thinks it's question begging. White clearly thinks it's not question begging. Does this guy cite White? Yes. I guess he's building on this Beck person who I haven't read. I guess I want that in here. I don't know where to put it. This is just going to be... this will just be a debate. We need to add Williams is the self and the... oh no, Williams is in here. So Williams is a key work for this. We need to add Oyoe. Is Oyoe in my Zotero database? Zotero is not loading. I can just check in here. Yes. Oh, no, it's a different Oyoe. Okay. We're going to put Oyoe in the Zotero database. So sorry, most of this is going to be off screen because it's going to be through my internet browser and Zotero, both of which I'm moving to the second screen if my internet browser will ever load. Whatever. We can put in white first. We're just going to put in one position for this, and you know, this position might just, I think maybe this position could just be nested under personal identity. I can delete this debate, but whatever. So this is White's argument. So I think White is pretty clear. We can just copy and paste them rather than paraphrasing. And then okay, so I gotta add this Oyoe guy, and I gotta add his article, and to add his article, I'm gonna have to add it to Zotero. It is now in Zotero. Where is he? He is University of Western Cape. And I said it was a different Oyoe before, but actually his sort of second name is Anthony, and I think it's the same guy. doesn't have a website, so we're using his Google Scholar page in a moment. Oops. No, something. The image address. What do you mean destination files? I call it something else. Okay, and University of Western Cape. Philosophy, I believe. I don't know. University of Western Cape is where? Cape Town. Makes sense. Okay, he's in there, and now we refresh the bibliography. Yeah, so this is Anthony. Maybe it's a different, no. I'll sort that out later. Okay, now we're good. So we copy and paste the PDF to the to read folder. And we create a new work record. And this is in Philosophia. I got close to submitting to Philosophia once, but I had misgivings. And anyways, when you submit, they ask you to suggest some reviewers, and I was like, no. So I didn't submit. Probably for the best. So where's his argument? I have notes from when I last taught this in a class, and that may tell me faster. I think it's on page 268. You know what? I don't care. This is somewhere in OYOA. I'll do it later. Because I have the notes somewhere. So, okay. Derail finished. We now have that little debate in there. I don't know whose side I'm on. I think neither of them, but I lean towards OYOA. So the first two examples, which are due to Bernard Williams, clearly, provide his argument for the thesis that bodily continuity is the crucial relation in personal identity. Let me close some stuff also. Okay, the third example, which is intended to bear the same relation to the second, which the second bears the first, is designed to forestall this conclusion. The third example provides another possible redescription of what is on the reductionist view in the instance of exactly the same case. By the time the third case is reached, however, I think it should be hard to suppose that the examples support either the view that identity depends on the continuity of memory and psychological dispositions, or the view that bodily continuity is crucial. Our intuitions are unstable in a way for which the reductionist seems to lack an account. If we take reductionism seriously, the cases should be unproblematic at the very worst. They should all arouse in us the same sort of ambivalence. The problem is they do not. Interesting. I don't agree, but whatever. We're putting the argument in. Whoops. Okie dokie. We can appreciate the seriousness of this problem for Parfit if we look at a number of other cases in which it arises. Consider the following example proposed by David Wiggins. Example 4, the double transplant case. Suppose that for some subject the two brain hemispheres are psychologically indistinguishable, and imagine that each one is transplanted to a different body for which it becomes a sole source of control. A single transplant case in which one hemisphere is transplanted to and the other is destroyed. The identity of the original subject seems to be preserved. In the present case, each transplant recipient has the same degree of bodily and psychological continuity with the original person as exists in the case of a single transplant. Consequently, the reductionist has no basis for choosing either a unique successor or the original subject. Thus, since identity is necessarily one-to-one, this is evidently not the case in which, for reductionist, personal identity is preserved. This in itself is not a problem for Parfit. Parfit distinguishes personal identity from survival, which he characterizes as the preservation of what matters in the identity relation. For Parfit, the survival consists is the same as psychological continuity, which requires for identity without the requirement of uniqueness. Unlike identity, then, the requirement of survival need not be 1-1. The relation of survival need not be 1-1. For Parfit, neither identity nor survival requires that psychological continuity have either its normal cause or even a reliable cause. Hence, the double transplant case, one survives as each of the resulting people, and everything that matters is preserved in both. Parfit's characteristic of survival, however, requires some clarification. The preservation of what matters might mean the preservation of what makes life worth living. In this sense, what matters might not be preserving the existence of some future self in whom one would not hesitate to say one survived. For instance, one might, for example, be tortured at some time in the future to such an extent that one would prefer both before the torture and during it not to go on living. But the preservation of what matters might have a stronger sense. It might mean that there are future person stages for which one would have or be justified in having the sort of special concern that one ordinarily has or one's future self. In this sense, what matters is preserved in the torture case. One would normally make very extreme sacrifices where one's present desires were concerned to alleviate some of the pain in the self to be tortured. It's the stronger sense in which it's plausible to identify survival. The preservation of what matters is in this sense, which I would say is the expression, and in which I shall assume Parfit uses it. In spite of Parfit's distinction between identity and survival, the double transplant case seems problematic in a way that the normal case doesn't. Although he claims that everything that matters is preserved, this conclusion is not clearly supported by our intuitions. This problem becomes acute in the following variation of the double transplant case. Example 5, the multiple fission case. We can imagine cases of fission in which one splits like an amoeba into two indistinguishable replicas. Consider then a case in which one splits simultaneously into 1,000 or 10,000 different replicas. Is it really plausible to suppose that everything that matters is preserved in the case and that one survives as 10,000 different individuals? Another case which is mentioned in the literature which is often mentioned in the literature, also raises serious problems. Before we go to that, this multiple fission case, this is somebody similarly whined about this. Maybe Parfit responded to it in comments. Looks like it's maybe Wolf. Yeah, this is wolf. So let's put this in Hypernomicon. Let's also move wolf over. Because wolf and white are making the same argument. Is wolf in here? Yes. White doesn't cite wolf. So where does this go? This is... So white here is characterizing this as a problem for theories of personal identity like Parfit's. Properly speaking, it seems like a problem for people who think that concern should work the way Parfit thinks. And people like, for instance, this Maddie Eklund paper I just read point out that these are separate questions because concern doesn't necessarily track identity. And even Parfit points out concern doesn't track identity for like the obvious point that survival and identity come apart. But then so I guess properly speaking what white is going after is not about identity. He's going after the sort of happiness of survival. So let's charitably read white to say he's not talking about personal identity at all. And now, given that, maybe it shouldn't even be nested under personal identity. Maybe it should just be an ethical question, a straightforward question about, I was about to say prudence, a straightforward question about survival, which we're accepting for the sake of the argument doesn't involve personal identity. I don't know where to put it. It seems like it shouldn't be under personal identity. We're just... We're just putting it under, for now we're putting it under, is personal identity relevant for practical purposes, which I've now also moved under ethics, and that lets say where it sorts it out for now. Wait, no, I'm not. Okay, and let's also add Wolff's argument while we're here. Cool. Done. Back to white. Another case which is often mentioned in the literature also raises serious problems. Example 6, the teletransportation case. Imagine a machine that records the type, speeds, and directions of all the particles that make up a subject in the initial location. The information is sent to a terminal location where the different distinct set of particles is used to produce an exact replica. At the same time, the particles at the initial location are dispersed, and it's claimed the subject travels continuously between the initial and terminal locations. Since this is a non-branching case which preserves psychological continuity, Parfit is committed to it being a case of identity. More importantly, on Parfit's view, everything that matters is preserved. Thus, we should have all the same responses to this case which we have to a normal case, and it's not clear that we do. Again, consider a variation that's sometimes been proposed, a defective teletransportation case. You make a duplicate, blah, blah, blah. So far, we have been looking at cases in which all the Parfit's conditions for survival are satisfied. In spite of this, our responses are neither consistent with our responses to ordinary cases nor consistent with each other. Let's now look briefly at the group of mental states. At a group of mental states which are not related to our conscious life history by the direct psychological relations that for Parfit matter, but which we treat as though they were. The beliefs and desires of our unconscious subsystems, though they may be causally continuous with our conscious experiences, are not in the relevant sense psychologically continuous with them. We do not, for example, remember such unconscious mental states, nor do they contribute to our actions the way that our consciously accessible beliefs and desires do. Thus, given Parfit understanding of what matters, we should dissociate ourselves with the effects of such states on our behavior. I mean, yes, insofar as you think the states are yours, but like that doesn't mean you don't. Okay, whatever. In spite of the lack of psychological continuity, however, we do not consider ourselves free to disown such beliefs, desires, and their effects. Yeah, yes we do. These unconscious states are as much a part of the self as their conscious states, and we do ordinarily assume responsibility for their consequences. Thus, not only do we have different reactions to cases that should be equivalent to Parfit's view, but we have similar reactions to cases that should be significantly different. Okay, where do we put this? It's an argument against reductionism. And we should do the transportation. Even though the transportation is a really shitty argument. So I said the defective one was a duplicate, but no, it's a time lag. That's fine. There's a possible reply that Parfit might find tempting. Parfit might claim that we're responding on a case-to-case basis to relevant features of the examples, giving Parfit's views about which features are relevant. Then this is what he must say to explain the variety of our responses. The difficulty is that Parfit has no explanation of which irrelevant features elicit our responses and why such responses are elicited by those features. I don't intend to suggest that such an explanation isn't possible. I shall suggest, however, that when we attempt to explain why these responses are forthcoming, we shall find that the explanation undermines the claim that the features to which we're responding are in fact irrelevant to identity and survival. So there's a bit of a back and forth here, but it's small enough that I'm not going to put it in Hypernomicon. Non-autonomous access relations. The problem for Parfit stems from his inability to explain our intuitive responses to the puzzles of personal identity. I shall now outline a different theory in order to account for the diversity of these reactions, but the objection so far has been largely addressed to Parfit's view, not to reductionist view in general, and given the range of causal conditions which a proponent of reductionism might require for identity or survival, the emphasis on Parfit might seem unjustified. On Parfit's view, as we have seen, the only condition necessary for survival is the degree of psychological connectedness and continuity is sufficiently high, and it's not necessary that it should be caused in the usual way or even in a way that's reasonably reliable. Such a view is arguably the minimal version of reductionism. Thus, the assumption that the problems for Parfit are problems for reductionism in general may seem unwarranted. There are two reasons, however, why the emphasis on Parfit's version of reductionism should not be a drawback. First, a number of the cases we've looked at raise problems not only for Parfit, but for reductionists who claim that survival requires psychological connections that hold in virtue of either reliable or even normal causal processes. This is true of the memory switch case, example 1. Future pain case, example 2, the California therapy case, example 3, because the causal explanation of the psychological connections is the same in all three cases while our reactions differ. Second, suppose that Parfit's claim that the question of survival depends only on the existence of psychological connections, regardless of whether they're reliably caused, is false. It's at any rate open to serious question. None of the examples we've looked at, however, except the version of the teletransportation case, example 6, in which the creation of the replica is accidental, involve a case that's unreliable. And although all the examples involve abnormal causes, the claim that the normal cause is necessary seems hard to sustain. If there are no facts about personal identity and survival over and above the facts about psychological connections and their underlying causes, it's hard to see how the normality of these causes could be what matters. The details of the actual causal process may be inaccessible and may be quite different from what we now take them to be. Thus, if psychological connectedness are reliably caused, were not enough to ensure survival, that is, to ensure what matters to us is preserved, it's difficult to see how adding that the causal process were normal could possibly help. These arguments raise a serious difficulty. Suppose we abandon, as I've suggested in section 1, we should the intuition supporting non-reductionism. What further facts, beside the facts available in Parfit's version of reductionism, or in one of the alternative versions, such as the one according to which psychological continuity requires that the causal relations be normal, could explain those variations in our responses which raise the problems for Parfit? What further facts are there, in other words, to account for the variety in the data? Once we've been on reductionism, the cases that cause problems for Parfit seem to raise difficulties for which none of the resources that remain could be adequate. The problem is not insurmountable if we recognize that there is an alternative to all the versions of reductionism we've considered so far. Let's begin by reformulating Parfit's characterization of reductionism in terms of supervenience in one of its senses. For a notion of supervenience, what fits Parfit's very closely, see Horgan. Cool. Reductionism will then entail that fixing some set of impersonal facts fixes the personal fact as well, or if we refer to the facts that do the fixing as the supervenience base, the thesis is that personal facts have their supervenience base in some set of impersonal facts. This way of reformulating reductionism allows us to characterize clearly between two distinct components of Parfit's characterization. The first is the claim that the facts of personal identity over time just consist in a set of impersonal facts. The second is the claim that the facts of a person's existence consist in facts about the existence of the brain and body, together with facts about the occurrence of a series of interrelated physical and mental events. Whereas Parfit's first claim places no limits on the impersonal facts containing the supervenience base. The second claim limits the supervenience base to facts about mental physical events associated with that person's body, or more accurately, the impersonal facts associated with the body of the person in question and those associated with the bodies of any competitors who may have claims of being that person at other times. I shall assume that in what follows that the body includes the brain. In order to distinguish the two claims, I'll call the first weak reductionism and the second strong reductionism. Okay, yeah, we're not putting that in, I think. Maybe. We'll see in a moment. Each thesis is two versions, one of which is a claim about personal identity and one of which is a claim about survival. Weak reductionism regarding identity, survival. The fact as to whether person B is the same person existing at a later time, person A is a survivor of A, supervenes on impersonal facts. Strong reductionism, it's the Parfit stuff. Parfit and most other proponents of reductionism are committed to the strong reductionism regarding both identity and survival. In fact, as I just pointed out later, Parfit is committed to an even stronger claim regarding survival. As I argue, however, if strong reductionism is true in either of its versions, it's true for reasons that are very different from those normally cited in its support. The strong reductionist claim that limits the supervenience base of the psychological and physical makeup of all the relevant competitors involves the following ordinarily implicit assumption. Let's actually put this in, because cognitivism is, I was about to say weak, but psychological continuity is strong. So I don't, maybe, there, okay, yeah, I was about to say, okay, yeah, you will see what I'm about to say when I just do it. So there is going to be a position under reductionism called weak reductionism. And ditto for strong reductionism. And I really gotta italicize A and B, don't I? The problem is Control I doesn't always work. It's been buggy since day one. And let's do that for weak reductionism too. And the conventionalists are weak reductionists, and the psychological continuity theorists are strong reductionists. And that is how it works in Hypernomicon. So it makes the tree kind of big, but that's what we got to do. The strong reductionist claim that limits the supervenience-based psychological and physical makeup of all the relevant competitors involves the following ordinarily implicit assumption. While such relations to psychological access as well as memories of past actions and one's intentions regarding future actions matter for identity and survival, it's only such internal access relations which do. Suppose the assumption turns out to be wrong. In such a case, the following strategy would be possible. We could explain the difference in our responses to cases equivalent of Parfit's view by reference to differences in relations between person stages which are not found among internal access relations. On the view also suggests the relations between person stages relevant to survival will include both internal and external relations. Thus, it is the assumption that all the relevant relations are internal, which I shall now call into question. The notion of internal access relation requires some explanation. Let's say that mode of access to past events or actions is a mode of access to including control of present or future events or actions is autonomous if and only if it's possessed by all possible functionally normal adults. Thus, if one's access via memory to the event of one's falling from bicycle at age 6 is via an autonomous mode of access because access of this type. Thus, one's access because access of this type is shared by all actual and possible functionally normal adults. Not me. Imagine, however, a subject with an apparent memory of such an actual incident which has been produced by on the basis of an otherwise inaccessible memory traces by a neurophysiologist aided by a computer. This mode of access is not shared by all functionally normal adults, but only by those living in societies that have the technological capacity and have made the necessary social arrangements to make such access possible. Hence, this mode of access is non-autonomous. Similar remarks apply to one's ability to form intention on which one's future self will act, formed in the usual way. This intention provides an autonomous source of access to one's future self, implanted directly in that future self by hypnotist acting on one's present orders. The intention provides a form of access which is non-autonomous. It is this notion of autonomy which I shall use to explain the sense in which both the proponents of non-reductionism and the proponents of strong reductionism assume that the access relations relevant to identity and survival are internal. Both groups assume that the relevant relations are autonomous in the sense defined. I don't want that in Hypernomicon, but I may end up having to put it in. Maybe it'll go into an argument. The solution to the problems for Parfit turns on the existence of modes of access which are non-autonomous. The claim will be that the references to differences in non-autonomous access relations can explain differences in our responses to examples that are equivalent where autonomous access relations are concerned. The examples of non-autonomous access relations involving the implementation of memories and intentions by hypnotists and neurophysiologists provide almost no clue, however, as to how such relations might figure in the example that cause Parfit difficulties. The only kinds of access relations ordinarily discussed in connection with such examples are memories and intentions, and as we've seen, those are normally autonomous. Thus, we need a general characterization of access which has the following consequences. A significant number of our most important sources of access to our future selves, both in problem cases for Parfit and normal cases, are non-autonomous. It may help then if we consider what access amounts to in the context of unrelated personal identities. Suppose we think of access in the context of governmental policy. The two basic components of this kind of access are knowledge and control. Someone who has very little notion of the workings of government and the kinds of governmental actions which are feasible will have very little meaningful access to public policy. Similarly, someone who understands the general workings of government but lacks any knowledge on the constraints imposed by actual circumstances will lack significant access to government decisions. Even someone well-informed, however, may lack access in the relevant sense if he or she cannot exercise influence over those in power. Such knowledge could not be translated into power to have his or her desires and intentions to determine policy. In the remainder of this section, I'll use this general conception of access to examine a variety of forms, both autonomous and non-autonomous, which access relations may take in the kind of cases which can cause problems for Parfit. Consider again the teletransportation case example 6 in the certain possible worlds, one which might be called teletransporter extensions. That is, one has what might be called teletransporter extensions, that is, persons whose presence at the terminal end of a teletransporter has an appropriate explanation in terms of one's own presence at the initial end. In all those worlds in which one has a teletransporter extension, there are certain access relations between oneself and one's extension in virtue of the normal functional makeup one has in common with one's extension. One has access to and in particular can exercise control over a teletransporter extension by forming intentions to perform certain actions after the extension comes into existence. One can also exercise control by cultivating long-term dispositions to behave in certain ways. The teletransporter extension, of course, has access to one via memory. Since these relations hold for all functionally normal subjects and their extensions, they are autonomous. Contrast this with the kind of access relations which exist between oneself and one's descendants. If one's determined that a child, grandchild, or more distant descendant should perform a certain action, one can invoke reasons or engage in persuasion and bribery, indulge in intimidating or brainwashing, issue orders or threats, or rely on respect or for force of habit. Each of these strategies depends on the specific features of particular societies, and none can be effected merely in virtue of one's normal functional makeup. However, these strategies for exercising control yield sources of access which are non-autonomous, and most of these sources of non-autonomous action which are available in the case of one's descendants will also be available with minor variations in the case of one's teletransporter extensions, although many of these strategies would be difficult to effect directly where a teletransporter extension is concerned. Most would be possible to arrange with the help of other people. Thus, the teletransportation case, unlike the case involving one's descendants, exhibits a variety of both autonomous and non-autonomous relations. The double transport case double transplant case provides a second example of the significance of the distinction between autonomous and non-autonomous relations. For those who accept strong reductions regarding survival, it must be supposed that the claim to be someone in whom we survive is equally strong, whether it's made by one of the two recipients of one of our brain hemispheres or by the person who remains when we have one hemisphere removed and destroyed. This such analysis is not plausible, except on the assumption that only autonomous access relations are relevant to survival. This is because while each of the two resulting persons in the double transplant case has the same autonomous relation to us as the single resulting person in the hemisphere removal case, the non-autonomous relations may differ substantially. Okay, let's see that. How does that work? To see how the single transplant case and the double transplant case might differ with respect to non-autonomous access relations, consider a third example in which the departure from the single transplant case is more extreme. In the most efficient case, example 5, in which one splits into 1,000 or 10,000 replicas, as in the single or double transplant case, all of our autonomous access relations are preserved. Many of the external sources of access which one would normally have to single future extension would, however, be absent in the case of massive replication. An important source of knowledge of our future behavior stems from our knowledge of our future environment, the people to whom we have significant relations, the roles we play, and problems they present, and the opportunities they offer. The difficulty in the multiple fission cases that the environment so defined could never absorb the number of replicas in question. People of significance to us could not maintain personal relations with each of our replicas, nor could we maintain a pattern of concern for this many future extensions with which considerations are which characterizes our relations to our future selves. Moreover, this number of replicas would be unable to share the roles we play or the opportunities we anticipate, hence our ability to predict our future actions and experiences on the basis of our knowledge of our environment would be lost, as would our ability to control such actions and experiences on the basis of our present control of our environment. In the double transplant case, the loss of non-autonomous access through the duplication might or might not be of crucial significance, but in the case of multiple fission, the replication involved would destroy the major source of a non-autonomous action to our future selves. I think I would also mess with the autonomous. I'm not sure if that matters. I don't know if I buy the hemisphere split case. Well, oh yeah, he says might not be of crucial significance. So okay. The intrinsic-extrinsic distinction. The multiple fission case example 5 provides a model of strategy I shall adopt in section 5 in dealing with the problems raised by strong reductionism. These problems stem from the fact that if strong reductionism is true, there is no appropriate explanation of our intuitive reaction to a number of puzzle cases. There is no explanation of our reactions by references to what if strong reductionism is true or the relevant factors, the physical and causal continuities, and the autonomous access relations. My strategy in section 5 will be to examine these cases in light of the non-autonomous access relations to determine whether or not they provide a better set of explanations of our intuitions. Proponents of strong reductionism, however, have suggested a number of principles which, if true, would rule out non-autonomous access relations as relevant to identity survival. In this section, then, I'll consider whether these principles really do preclude an explanation of our intuition in terms that are non-autonomous. I haven't wanted to put this autonomous, non-autonomous thing into Hypernomicon because I don't like the way he's characterizing it. But it seemed like maybe I needed in, because we're about to get some back and forth arguments about the importance of non-autonomy access relations. We'll see. To see what would be involved in explaining our responses to difficult cases by reference to non-autonomous access relations, consider once again the example of a teletransporter. Among the possible sources of non-autonomous access to the subject who steps into the machine to the subject who steps out are the following. First is the legal title of the subject stepping out to the possessions of the person who stepped in. If legal title is preserved, then the initial subject can control to a large extent the environment as the terminal subject by providing for that subject. Second, there are legal and social relations of the individual at the terminal location and the persons who figure importantly in the life of the individual at the initial end. Suppose that the terminal individual remains married to the spouse of the initial individual, that he or she has the same family ties, that he or she is a member of the same groups or a citizen of the same country and a friend of the same individuals. This will increase not only the information the initial subject will have about the terminal subject, but again the initial subject's ability to plan and control the terminal subject's future. Third, there's a source of non-autonomous access in the general contractual rights and obligations of the terminal subject. If those remain intact, there's a further source of rational control for the person contemplating the process. Whether we think intuitively of the person of the terminal location as a copy of the original person, as in one's own case, whether one thinks of the person as a copy of oneself, depends on the view I'm suggesting to a large extent on how we imagine other people responding. If the process is described as a means of transportation, then we are thinking of a society in which the subject at the terminal end is taken to be the original and not merely a copy. If personal identity and survival are determined in part by external factors of the kind under consideration, then it's not far from the truth to claim that in a society in which teletransportation is interpreted as transportation, then it is transportation. So we're going to make this an argument for conventionalism, practice-based conventionalism, specifically public conventionalism, because that's what it is. And we can basically just elide over a lot of the non-autonomous, autonomous stuff and just get in there quickly. Why do I need to scroll? I thought I made it to section 5, but where did I? I was here. Okay, yeah. Cool. I think we just get to skip over a lot of that stuff I wasn't wanting to put in. Explain the case in terms of the relevance of non-autonomous access, then, as a consequence that members of one society might survive teletransportation, whereas the members of another society would not. This claim, however, is open to objections both from those who think teletransportation must preclude survival and those who think that in such cases survival is guaranteed. It's a common response among philosophers, for example, to suppose a society that interprets teletransportation as transportation must be mistaken. According to this response, teletransportation is always incompatible with preservation of personal identity. The response is based on considerations like the following. Suppose the machine that dispersed the particles of the person in the initial location fails. In such a case, the person who is still in the initial location exists simultaneously with the person at the terminal location. Since the former, it's alleged, is obviously identical with the original subject, the person at the end must be a copy. It's then concluded that the person at the terminal end must be a copy even when it functions correctly. A similar objection involves the fact that even if the particles of the subject at the initial end are dispersed, the information about the particles might be transmitted to two terminal locations. Two persons would then be created, each with the same relation to the original. Since they could not both be identical with the original, and since there are no grounds to choose between them, neither one could be identical with the person at the initial end. Because in this case, in the case where the machine works in the relevant relation between the initial subject and the terminal subject is the same as in the case in which it doesn't work, neither relation is one of identity. These arguments, due in part to Williams, rely on principles like the following. Whether a future person will be me must depend only on the intrinsic features of the relations between us. It cannot depend on what happens to other people. So this is coming back. I think I'm... Do I have this somewhere in here? I don't. So this is an objection to public conventionalism. I hope this is reasons and persons that's being cited. This principle counts against our regarding the person who steps out of the teletransportator as identical with the person who stepped in, for even in the case in which the teletransporter works correctly. So do I have actually teletransportation? Transport. No, I mean I should have the debate like, do you survive stepping out the transporter in here under person identity? And then it'll spend most of its life collapsed because I don't care. Not that because it's gonna, a lot of stuff is gonna end up moved under this debate. So it's gonna duplicate a lot of stuff from the tree, and so I'll leave it collapse most of the time. Okay, and now we start clicking and dragging things. Because the no fact of the matter view means that it's indeterminate. The no person view, I guess you don't because he never existed. Non-reductionism, they basically all say you don't survive. I'm just gonna do that. Actually, no, that's too fast. Actually, it's not too, well. Whoa, what did I just do? Okay, why is this here? Why is this under no fact of the matter? I'm just detaching. You are detached. You are detached. I think this probably gets attached too, but I'll leave it just for safe keeping. Okay, what else? The no person view, non-reductionism, okay, whatever. Relativism, conventionalism. According to all the conventionalisms, it is some cases you do and some cases you don't. That's not technically true. Because according to public, in some cases you do and in some cases you don't. But then according to private, it depends. But not on, okay, whatever. We're collapsing conventionalism for now. I'm just ignoring the rest of that. Psychological continuity. You survive. And that's it. I'll add more later. Okay, and now I did that because I wanted to do this intrinsic thing. Somebody makes this, but whatever. So just now I put this in somewhere in Hypernomicon. Now the question is, where the heck did I put it? Can I just go back until I find it? Intrinsic features, so this is just going to be a separate position, actually. Good. And now up to the, whoops, not ethics, up to the teletransportation. Great. That's a lot of stuff, but important to have in there. If it failed, Williams claimed sure that the person remaining at the initial end is identical with the person. Thus, supposes in cases when the teletransporter worked, it preserved identity. Then, whether the person at the initial location when the switch was thrown was identical with the person at the terminal end would depend on whether the person at the initial end continued to exist past the time the switch was thrown. Hence, the assumption that teletransporter could preserve identity violates Principle 1. Given his commitment to Principle 1, the fact that he does not distinguish personal identity and survival, I shall assume that Williams is a proponent of the following thesis. The form of which concerns survival as well as the form concerning identity. Very strong reductionism regarding identity. The fact that whether a person B at the same person existing at the later time as person A is a survivor of A supervenes on impersonal facts associated with bodies of A and B. It doesn't depend on facts about any other people. Thus, whereas for strong reductionist identity, survival supervenes on the autonomous relations between A, B, and any relevant competitors. For a very strong reductionist like Williams, identity survival supervenes on the autonomous relations between A and B alone. Whereas Williams would object to the claim that society or culture might construe the teletransporter correctly as transportation, Parfit would object that society might view it correctly as death, at least where this is taken to be incompatible with survival. Parfit is committed to the claim that teletransportation always guarantees survival, regardless of how it's construed by those involved. For Parfit, the fact that the particles of the subject of the initial teletransportation location could have failed to disperse, or that one more duplicate could have been made, more than one duplicate could have been made, is irrelevant to what matters, namely survival. Parfit holds this, even though he holds an analog of Williams Principle 1 for survival, that is, he holds Principle 2, whether my relation to some future person P contains what matters depends only on the intrinsic features of the relation between us. It can't depend on what happens to other people. Let's just check the citation. No, it's easier to find it here. And it seems like it's probably true. Let's go to 267. Perfect. I don't know if this is a quote from Parfit, whether my relation to some... Yeah, so this is a quote, not a quote. Okay. And this amounts to holding very strong reductionism regarding survival. Parfit can hold both these theses because he allows that survival need not be 1-1. Where identity is concerned, Parfit rejects very strong reductionism in principle 1. And given that the teletransporter preserves psychological continuity, Parfit's claim that survival need not be 1-1, together with his claim that psychological continuity is what matters regardless of its cause, yields the conclusion that in case of teletransportation, survival is always assured. Like Parfit, I reject principle 1. Case of fission in which one of the duplicates is immediately destroyed may as well be a case in which one's identity is preserved. This is possible even though if the duplicate had lived, one would have been identical with either duplicate, would not have been identical with either duplicate, but would have best survived in both. But unlike Parfit, I reject principle 2. Not only can one's identity with some future person depend on what happens to other people, but whether that person's existence preserves what matters to one, whether one survives as that person, can depend on other people as well. As we saw in section 3 in the multiple fission case, whether what matters is preserved may depend on how many future persons are psychologically continuous with one's present self. So I think we basically already have this argument in here. I'm not sure we need to double it up. Yeah, it's already in there, basically, implicitly. Too many duplicates may prevent what matters from being preserved, even though the intrinsic relations between one present self and each of the duplicates do not seem significantly different. So we'll just... Now we're good. This is a case in which others who make the difference are competitors. Another such case we've looked at is the defective teletransporter case. Consider the person created the far-flung corner of the universe many years hence. Given that a normal duplicate is also created, one might plausibly feel that the existence of a more remote duplicate scarcely matters at all. In the absence of such a normal duplicate, however, one might invest in the more remote duplicate. It would represent one's only chance for survival, something like the concern one usually reserves for one's ordinary future selves. In addition to providing the candidates for our future selves, other people provide the means in virtue of which we gain non-autonomous access to such selves and their competitors. If, for example, there is a social convention concerning cases of multiple duplication whereby one of the duplicates inherited the entire network of social relations, one might then regard oneself as surviving the duplication and regarding the others as largely irrelevant. In that duplicate, the other is largely irrelevant. Such a convention, after all, would prevent just the situation which made it plausible in the case which, without the convention, to suppose that one did not survive, namely the situation in which none of the thousands of duplicates can inherit any substantial portion of one's significant relations to others. This rejection of principle 2 is not without precedent. Robert Nozick has claimed that whether what matters to one is preserved into the existence of some future person P does depend on who the competitors of P are. In other words, Nozick rejects very strong reductionism regarding survival as well as identity. Even for Nozick, however, the question depends only on autonomous relations between oneself and the various candidates for one being a future self. For being one's future self, thus for Nozick, strong reductionism is true regarding both identity and survival. My view, even this claim is false. Strong reductionism is false for both identity and survival. Whether survival or identity is concerned, weak reductionism provides the best account. Since Principle 1 and Principle 2 are intuitively plausible, however, I should provide two more variations on the future pain case, example 2, to show that intrinsic non-intrinsic distinction cannot bear the strain to which Parfit's theory subjects it. For Parfit, anxiety is not an appropriate response to any future pain case in which one's torture will be preceded by a memory and personality switch. Once the amnesia and the personality change has been affected, the psychological continuity and connectedness, which for Parfit are what matters, have been completely destroyed. One has no reason to fear pain that will be felt by such a subject, has no more reason to feel pain that will be felt by such a subject than to fear pain that will be felt by a perfect stranger. The normal case, in contrast, is one in which psychological continuity and connectedness remain intact. In the normal case, if one experiences a period of intense pain, one is psychologically connected to and continuous with earlier self that anticipates the pain. Such connections exist both in virtue of one's conscious current memories of one's earlier self and in virtue of one's dispositions to form such conscious memories as occasions arise. The same is true of the continuity between the personality of the earlier self and the latter self. The continuity is manifest in the similarity of occurrent episodes of thought and behavior, but also is manifest in the similarity of dispositions underlying such episodes. One's relation to the future person stages that are to suffer pain might, however, be somewhat different. Consider the following sequence of cases. Parfit considers a number of similar cases, but doesn't seem to recognize their full force. Example 8, the no occurrent memories case. Suppose one knew that one would be tortured at some future date. One might believe with good reason that once the ordeal began, one would be too preoccupied with immediate sensations of pain to entertain conscious memories of any prior experience. This thought, if it occurred, would be unlikely to provide any consolation. Whether one consciously reflects on any of one's past experiences is likely to be a function of the pacing of the ordeal and the presence or absence of any reminders of the past, and such factors seem irrelevant to the question of how painful the experience would be. Nor is it plausible to attach to factors such as the importance that Parfit wants to attach to identity and survival. The same line of reasoning applies to the conscious manifestations of one's characteristic personality traits. The undetected memory switch case. In this case, imagine suffering the psychological discontinuity described in the future pain case. At the flip of a switch, one's memories and personality are replaced by the delusory memories and new personality. The difference in this case is that the switch is thrown at the same time the pain begins, and one's conscious experiences as described in the no occurrent memories case. Hence, there will be no conscious manifestations of psychological difference induced when the switch is flipped. Thus, like the last change, this change from the normal case should produce no rational grounds for consolation in thinking of the future pain. Example 10, the sporadic occurrent memories case. In the final variation, imagine either that the switch is flipped shortly before the pain starts, that the ordeal is paced slightly more slowly, allowing a few minutes of relief, or that there are more reminders of the past. Although this makes a difference in one's conscious experience, this difference seems too trivial to provide a plausible justification for viewing this prospect more optimistically than either the normal case or the other two variations of the normal case. In this case, however, simply is the future pain case, with regard to which Parfit is committed to claiming that one has no reason to fear the painful experience. The problem is that the importance of the difference between the normal case, in which the anxiety about the future pain is justified, and the future pain case, in which does not seem to dissolve on examination. Since this is the most central case of the kind of intrinsic difference which Parfit thinks matters to survival, his assumption that only such intrinsic differences matter seems unwarranted. I wonder if I should split this into personal identity depends on intrinsic features and survival depends on intrinsic features, and then haven't got a clue where survival goes. I have a survival entry in the glossary. Brad, Mitchell, and West conflate survival and personal identity. Parfit's teasing them apart is why I'm facing this question about whether I split this thing into survival and personal identity. Oi. That's just going to be enough. now do I put this argument against parfit? I think so. I'm not actually sure I understand how his argument goes here. Or maybe it doesn't attack the intrinsicness, except elliptically by attacking Parfit's view about what we have reason to anticipate. I may investigate more in the future, but for now we're good. Non-autonomous relations in the explanation of our intuitive judgments. The question that I now want to consider is whether reference to the non-autonomous relations can solve the original problems for proponents of the strong reductionist claim that what matters depends on the non-autonomous features. These problems arose because this claim made it impossible to explain our different intuitions regarding the three versions of the memory switch case. It should be clear by this point that these three examples, though equivalent as regards what Parfit and Williams think matters, are likely to suggest very different situations where non-autonomous access relations are considered. The description of the original memory switch case not only leaves open the possibility that the non-autonomous access relations are inherited by the person who inherits the memories, it encourages the assumption. The claim is best explained by reference to what the psychologists refer to as default assignments. In understanding the stories that make up the examples, we adopt assumptions that are not strictly given in the stories themselves, assumptions that are subject to revision as new information comes in, and in the absence of other cues, it's natural to assume that the body that inherits one's memories and intentions will have roughly the same capacity to act on those intentions and realize one's projects as any of one's normal future selves. This is a reasonable assumption for those whose projects and relations to others are not importantly tied to their particular bodily makeup. Thus, the first example encourages us to assume that the relation between autonomous access and non-autonomous access is fixed. My cat is doing something. I don't know what she's doing. The other cat is dead. Oh, she's eating, I think. That's fine. This is a reasonable assumption for those whose projects in relation to others are not importantly tied to their particular bodily makeup. Thus, the first example encourages us to assume that the relation between autonomous axis and non-autonomous axis is fixed. There is nothing to suggest that what's nonetheless a real possibility. That autonomous and non-autonomous axis may come apart, and that someone who inherits all of one's social relations may be more likely to carry on one's relationships and commitments and to realize one's intentions and projects than someone who inherits one's psychological makeup. In the future pain case, by contrast, the normal relations between autonomous and non-autonomous cases cannot be taken as given. If you are told that you will experience amnesia and be given to this of memories and new personality traits, there is a clear contrast established between the first person and third person perspectives on your identity from the point of view of the person in charge, and by implication the outside world generally, the person with your body remains you in spite of the loss of autonomous access. This significance of the fact that people in the story refer to the person who will suffer as you. So White does not think characterizing the person who will suffer as you begs the question, but he does think that it decides the question, which is sort of like begging the question, so it's worth mentioning here. Oh boy. We already have White. So maybe I don't bother putting it in. The California therapy case, like the original memory switch example, strongly suggests that autonomous axis and non-autonomous axis are present or absent together. The external perspective that the example suggests is not one in which you are tortured for your own long-term good. You know what? I kind of want this in. That's the cat. Kitty. Kitty. What do you want? She wants to enter the mirror, which of course is impossible. Cool. The California therapy case, like the original memory switch example, strongly suggests that autonomous axis and non-autonomous axis are present or absent together. The external perspective that the example suggests is not one in which you are tortured for your own long-term good, rather it's one in which your body and brain are manipulated in various ways during periods in which you remain unconscious. Notice that if we have explanation of the fact that the changes in the future pain case provide no consolation, what is the cat doing now? I don't know. We also have no explanation of the fact. We also have an explanation of the fact that the two variants in the future pain case, the no current memories case and the undetected memory switch case. In both those cases, the intrinsic or autonomous changes are less important than the continuity of non-autonomous relations. Whether it is we who are suffering depends in part on those around us who could be expected to respond as though it is. So I think this is why I didn't really understand the argument up here. Stuff was basically being left out, like White hadn't quite given what he thinks was going on there. Maybe I should have intuited this, because he's a conventionalist, but since he didn't make it explicit, I was wondering if we were supposed to be concluding this. Okay, here we go. In the undetected memory switch case and the no current memory case, there is no reason for an outside observer not to feel that it's the original subject who's being made to suffer. Nothing accessible to an ordinary observer in either case would reveal anything unusual. Yeah, this is helping me understand quite a bit. This contrasts with the California therapy case, in which it's relatively easy to dissociate the subject who suffers from the original subject. Not only does the original subject return unharmed with no memories of any painful experience, but our access to the suffering is mediated by the medical personnel, for whom the psychological dispositions of the person who suffers seem most significant. Compared with the California therapy case, the sporadic occurrent memories case provides fewer barriers to non-autonomous access and less support for dissociation where the subject who suffers is concerned. An emphasis on how little significance the memory switch may have for one's conscious experience under torture suggests an external perspective in which one would not seem significantly different to others. It may also suggest a society in which the facts about one's conscious experiences, rather than the facts about one's psychological dispositions, are highly accessible and salient. In any event, there is no suggestion, as there is in the original memory switch case and California therapy case, of a social practice and a perspective on oneself in which such dispositional changes would justify an attitude of indifference to the prospect of future pain. As a final test of the hypothesis that non-autonomous access relations matter, consider two more examples. Example 11, the realistic nightmare case. Suppose you are told by a psychologist on the basis of neurophysiological theory and a brain scan that you have had and will continue to have terrifying nightmares, which you never remember. Unlike ordinary dreams, however, these nightmares have no adverse consequences for your waking experiences and in fact tend to have positive effects. If Barfoot's right, whether you should be anxious ought to depend on the content of the nightmares, if your responses to the situation in the dreams are what your actual responses would be, if the characters in the dreams correspond closely to people you actually know, and if the past incidents you seem to remember actually occurred, then the psychologist's news should be serious case for concern. This is because from the inside, the case would be indistinguishable until you're awakened from one which the events actually occur. Alternatively, your reactions of the dream are unlike your normal reactions if the characters in your dream have no real counterparts, and if you seem to remember your very different past from your actual one, the psychologist's news should occasion no anxiety. In fact, whether the news that one experiences such nightmares produces and is justified in producing anxiety seems completely independent of the details of the nightmare's contents. Furthermore, most of us, if told that we experience such nightmares, would not feel any great anxiety. This fact is explained by the tenuousness of the non-autonomous relations in this society between waking and sleeping subjects. I think that's right. Nothing in this example suggests that outside observers would have any reason to feel anxiety for us. As a result, we feel no anxiety for ourselves. The tenuousness of such relations is independent of any facts we might be given about the detailed content of our nightmares. Sounds good. Compare this case with a variation of the California therapy case, the cut-rate therapy case. In this case, one undergoes the procedure of the California therapy case without either anesthesia or the benefit of any change in one's memories or personality. After the procedure, the memories of the pain are erased, leaving one satisfied with the therapy and eager to continue. In this kind of case, one would be very unlikely to continue the therapy once the facts are explained. But the difference between this case and the realistic nightmare case is again a difference in the non-autonomous access relations alone. Thus, it seems difficult to deny that such relations explain a wide variety of our actual responses. I guess. Let's put this argument in. Great. In spite of the examples, however, this feeling is likely to linger that to take the role of non-autonomous access relation seriously in questions of personal identity is to risk changing the subject. What must ultimately matter, after all, is not the third-person perspective of others, but the first-person perspective of the subject in question. To offer such an objection, however, is to miss an important ambiguity in the notion of the first-person point of view, as well as what is most important in the notion of non-autonomous access. On one possible construal, the first-person point of view is the subjective view, that is, the view defined by any set of facts which are independent of any objective facts whatsoever. The claim that personal facts must be manifest from such a perspective, then, is the non-reductionist claim that personal facts are subjective facts, and this claim, as we have seen, does not lead to a viable theory of personal identity. In another sense, though, the non-autonomous facts about the subject are a crucial part of that subject's first personal point of view. The perspective of the others is a significant, if not the significant, component of our internalized self-image. Other people, real or imagined, and internalized, are an important part of our psychological continuity and of our access to ourselves. Our internalized image of ourselves is seen from the outside, sleeping tranquilly and awakening being refreshed is part of what robs the realistic nightmare case of its capacity to produce concern. It's this internalization of others, in virtue of which our society's customs and practices are personal facts about what matters. If non-autonomous access relations are relevant to the explanation of our intuitive judgments about personal identity, we should reject Williams' Principle 1, Parfit's Principle 2, and Nozick's position, the claim that the personal facts about a given subject, including such facts as whether what matters is preserved in the existence of some future person P, supervene on facts about the intrinsic physical and psychological relations between the subject and P is too strong. And the claim is still too strong, even if we include in the supervenience base all the facts about intrinsic physical and psychological relations between the subject and all the other competitors of P. We should accept only some weaker supervenience claim that incorporates facts about the relations of non-autonomous access in the supervenience base. Here's a long footnote. There's an alternative for dealing with the apparent counterexamples to principles 1 and 2, which doesn't have the consequence that relations to other people must be included among the facts upon which identity and society and survival supervene. On this alternative, whether identity or what matters are preserved would depend not on the actual relations to the others of the subject in question, but on what relations he or she thinks obtain and has internalized. That's maybe a version of private cognitivism or private conventionalism. It's maybe a version of private conventionalism. Kind of. I don't know. It's a hybrid. The facts about identity and survival would then supervene on physical and psychological facts about the subject, the future person, and competitors. But this objection is not one which Williams, Parfit, or Nozick could take any comfort. Even if this alternative were to prove attractive, it would be extremely implausible to claim that whether S survives as P depends only on the intrinsic relations between S and P, or between S on the one hand and P's competitors on the other. On any ordinary interpretation, the requirements that the relations must be intrinsic would rule out S's beliefs about the social practices in his community, just as it rules out facts about the practices themselves. That's probably right. Thus, if Principle 2 and Nozick's position are not regarded as false in this alternative, they will be very different claims from what was apparently intended. Right, I think. The personal facts about a given subject do not supervene on any set of facts which does not include facts about the attitudes and feelings of others, the conventions and practices of such society, and in some cases even the society's level of technological development. Others who have objected to the narrowness of the set of facts considered relevant to the question of personal identity by most of the parties of the current debate include Norman Daniels, Peter McInerney, and Emily Rorty. Did this ever get published? Persons, schmersons. Persons and Human Beings by Christopher Gill. Persons and Human Beings by Christopher Gill did get published. No. No, there's a review by Alistair McIntyre titled Persons and Human Being, reviewing a collection called The Person and the Human Mind by Christopher Gill. And let's see. And Emily Oxenberg-Rody has a chapter in there called Persons and Personae, where she argues that appeals to personhood are rhetorical devices, dependent for their access on the types of audience to which the appeal is being made. Persons and Personae. Yeah, and this, of course, is like impossible to get a hold of, as is the book. Oh, maybe Persons and Personae got reprinted. Essays in Philosophy of Mind. Okay, I'm gonna look for that later. These other things sound interesting. Oh, whoops, that's the whole citation. Moral theory and the plasticity of personages. Cited by 94. Mostly ethics papers citing this, and then My Future Right or Wrong. Cited by one? Is this correct? Cited by S.L. White. I may be the second person if I cite this McInerney thing in the future. I'll be number 2 in the history of philosophy. This did not make a splash despite being published in Phil Studies. Okay, well, 2 more papers to add to the list. 3 if you count the wording. These claims lead naturally to a position I'll call metapsychological relativism. We are not putting... Okay, we'll put it in. The metapsychological facts are those facts about personal identity, responsibility, and the unity of character of the self, which are presupposed rather than settled by empirical psychology. The relativist claim then is that there could be 2 societies, neither of which whose members are either misinformed or irrational, but whose social practices settle the significant metapsychological issues in radically different ways. The teletransporter case provides a particularly plausible example. Is there any rational way of choosing between a society in which the social conventions support the use of teletransporters, transportation, and a society in which they do not? It's true of... Hello, Kitty Cat. It's true, of course, that given some relevant social conventions, it might seem irrational to adopt others. If, for example, the person at the terminal location retains the marital ties of family as the original person, then a convention by which contracts become null and void would seem at least highly unmotivated. The question, however, is whether between a society in which all the institutions practices support the use of teletransporters transportation and one in which none do, there would be any basis for rational choice. And it's not apparent on the basis and it is not apparent what the basis of such a choice would be. There seems to be no neutral way of choosing between the 2 societies. Shoemaker, I guess, makes the same point. Metapsychological relativism is not, of course, the facile conventionalism Oh no. That claims that one simply decides what counts as an extension of oneself. One cannot decide that by oneself. Okay, yeah. One cannot decide that by oneself. One means one's body, or alternatively one's psychology, except as a trivial stipulated definition. There's clearly more at stake in the puzzle cases than that. To say that there's more at stake, however, is not to endorse a belief in the kind of trans-historical fact for which the anti-relativism searched. We cannot decide as individuals what counts as our own continuation any more than we decide as individuals what kind of society we shall inhabit. But as we determine collectively the form and shape of our society, as my cat destroys a chair, we thereby also determine the boundaries of ourselves. Pretty decent article. Not bad at all. So that was fun. We're done with this now. Next up is Metapsychological Relativism, a Response to White by Steve Matthews, Monash University, but not doing that right now because in some period of time I have to go feed the dogs who live outside campus, and I don't have enough time to do this full article, and I don't think I want to sort of half do it and then do the other half when I come back. I'll just probably do everything when I come back or tomorrow or something like that. So I suspect nobody came here, but if anybody did, thank you for joining me, and I will see you next time I stream.